Hi, my name is Caroline Fogg, and today I'm here to talk to you about the application of humanitarian law in Syrian detainment camps. However, there are some graphic descriptions, so if those bother you, please feel free to leave now. To quote the ever-classy Stalin, "One death is a tragedy, but a million is a statistic." While he did in fact murder millions, his words still hold an air of truth. As American high schoolers, it's extremely difficult for us to understand the scope at which innocent lives are lost through the hands of an abusive regime. As fatalistic as it sounds, Stalin's words describe the desensitization our society has developed, a desensitization that I wish to address. With constant media coverage, we're used to seeing starving children in bombed cities flash upon our phones. The distance these screens provide between us and the nation where death is a reality allow us to place a level of detachment over these atrocities. This way, we can stay disillusioned that the world is a perfect place where genocides and stately abuses are a thing of the past. After all, we do have incredible organizations like the United Nations, but are these enough? To expound upon that question, I ask you to call upon the examples of the Joseph Stalin and the president of Syria, al-Assad. To answer your question, Gary Johnson, Aleppo is the most populous city in Syria. Unlike others, this nation is ravaged by civil wars. However, unlike other civil wars we've seen, there are multiple groups vying for power, including al-Assad's state, ISIS, and Tahrir al-Sham, which until last Saturday was known as Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, an armed rebel group with former ties to al-Nusra and al-Qaeda. If you've been paying any attention to the news recently, you should know that none of these groups are comprised of particularly wonderful people. All have committed crimes against humanity, but I'll be focusing on the actions of President Assad because most humanitarian law specifies the state as the actor. In 1948, the United Nations released its Universal Declaration of Human Rights, setting a precedent for humanitarian law and establishing a common standard of achievement, according to the Harvard Human Rights Journal. It was written in 1948 after the world witnessed the abuses of the Holocaust and Stalin's purges, and became the standard to which all nations are held. However, this declaration doesn't specify actions taken against violations, but Vice Broad and Bequeast of the Harvard Human Rights Journal explained that as new human rights violations have been identified, the human rights community has responded, first by naming and describing the violations, and then by establishing standards to prohibit such abuses. To compare these modern events to, I will introduce a figure, Joseph Stalin. After his war crimes in World War II and the subsequent Cold War, I think it's safe to say he's not a particularly admirable figure. During his reign as Soviet Premier from 1924 to his death in 1953, he killed millions of his own civilians. According to historian Cynthia Haven of Stanford University, he killed 30,000 kulaks, or wealthy landowners. They were deemed enemies of the state by his notorious 1937 Order Number 00447, which called for the mass exile and execution of socially harmful elements. Aside from those immediate deaths, he sentenced 2 million more to the gulags and starved nearly 5 million in the forced Ukrainian famine. In his reign of terror, torture, and forced migration, he created a tense atmosphere where acknowledgement of human rights abuses was avoided at all costs. This legacy of hiding from international condemnation continues in Assad's Syria, particularly an extraordinary rendition in the Syrian detainment camps. Vice Broad and Bequeast explained that extraordinary rendition is a hybrid of human rights violations, combining elements of arbitrary arrestment, enforced disappearance, forcible transfer, torture, denial of access to consular officials, and denial of partial trials. However, this differs from just plain state-sponsored disappearances because this is a practice in which the perpetrators attempt to avoid both legal and moral constraints by denying their involvement in the abuses altogether. The extraordinary rendition can be seen in the deportation of the kulaks to the gulags, but more importantly, in the Syrian detainment camps. The United Nations Human Rights Council states that the situation of detainees in Syria is critical and represents an urgent and large-scale crisis of human rights protection. The Human Rights Council continues in an assessment based upon 621 interviews conducted between March 10, 2011 and November 30, 2016, claiming that there is rampant use of torture, inhuman conditions in the detainment camps. Detainees are denied equal recognition before the law, medical treatment, and are subjected to overcrowding, lack of food, and unclean drinking water, often resulting in preventable diseases causing death. However, the most abhorring is the prevalent use of torture. Of the 621 detainees, almost all described having been the victims of and witness to torture and inhumane and degrading treatment. Over 200 former government detainees witnessed one or more deaths in custody. To fully understand these gruesome events, I will quote a description released by the United Nations of Human Rights Council on February 3, 2016. A detainee of a military security branch in Homs witnessed an elderly man being severely beaten and then hung by his wrists from the ceiling. The guards burnt his eyes with a cigarette and pierced his body with a heated, sharp metal object. After hanging in the same position for 3 hours, the man died. While this is particularly graphic and painful to hear, it is necessary to understand the extreme extent to which international law and human decency is being broken. Regardless of how you feel about the Syrian conflict, al-Assad's state is in clear violation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 5 states that no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. And after reading that passage, I think it is safe to label all of those events in direct violation. Al-Assad's state continues to break Articles 6, 7, and 8, which state that everyone has the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. This recognition obviously lacking in the extraordinary rendition present in Syrian detainment camps. These rights continue to be protected in Article 9, which states that no one shall be subjected to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile. Articles 10 and 11 elaborate to ensure the right to a fair and public hearing on criminal charges, and the right to be presumed innocent until guilty, according to the law. Forced detainment of untried citizens also violates Article 13, which provides that all persons have the right to leave any country and to return to their home country. Vice Bart and Berquist continue to point out that extraordinary rendition undermines the protection of Article 14, that all persons have the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. Vice Bart and Berquist continue that extraordinary rendition applies to other parts of the provision indirectly, including the right to form a family, the prohibition against arbitrary arrest, and arbitrary deprivation of property, freedom of thought, opinion, and expression, and the right to a social and international order in which the Declaration can be fully realized. Thus, they are explicitly violating 9 articles and implicitly violating 7. Thus, they are violating more than half of the Declaration just in the detainment camps. After that uplifting breakdown, well, let's look at what can be done to help. The United Nations Human Rights Council released recommendations after their independent analysis of deaths in detention in the Syrian Arab Republic. The Human Rights Council addresses what the Syrian government ought to do. They begin vaguely, stating the necessity to take urgent measures to protect the lives of all detainees in their custody, specifying that the Syrian government must immediately suspend any enforcement of capital punishment. Basically, they go on to restate the broken articles, yet don't elaborate specifically on what should be done to fix these abuses. Obviously, if there was an easy solution, it would have been enacted by now, but it's not so simple. The situation in Syria is especially complicated with the armed rebel groups and the foreign intervention. So when considering what must be done, one must consider its impacts in the international theater. However, there are actions that we as the United States can take without risking an armed conflict. Since the Syrian civil war started, there has been a massive influx of refugees, the likes of which have been unseen of since the Second World War. Of the 5 million refugees, the United States has only allowed 15,000 sanctuary. That comes to 0.2% of the total impacted. While there is a perceived terrorist threat, remember that these refugees are the victims of terrorism, fleeing from ISIL and the abusive regime. It is time that these people, deprived of a government's protection and forced to seek refuge in a foreign nation, receive the aid that we would want for ourselves. In 1948, after the world witnessed the atrocities of the Holocaust and Stalin's purges, we swore that never again would we as a global community allow such atrocities to continue. So I ask you, why do we allow them to? Thank you.